So the word today is fetish. Fetish. The word arrived in English and most other modern world languages from French, fétiche, but it came into French from Portuguese, and it dates back probably to around about the 16th, 17th century, at a time of the Portuguese colonial expansion into West Africa. And the original Portuguese word is feitiço, which means witchcraft or a spell. So the use of the word feitiço relates to the misinterpretation made by the Portuguese in Africa of local religious practices, which involved a kind of sculpture. The sculptures were often fairly simple figures. These Nkisi figures would be invested with certain substances, certain everyday substances like blood or charcoal or bone, that were believed to attract and to be capable of containing the spirits of the ancestors. They had certain crucial characteristics. There had to be a cavity in the middle of the figure that would contain these substances that could in turn contain the spirits. That would be covered in many cases with a piece of shiny metal or mirrored glass that symbolised the ability to see into the world of the spirits. There was one type of Nkisi statue, sculptures known as Nkondi, attracted the particular attention of European explorers and European missionaries. Not just their attention, but often their horror. A type of Nkisi sculpture that represented spirits that were charged with righting wrongs or with seeking vengeance or with actually doing harm to another living being. All of these Nkisi sculptures were used in a ritual manner where the user would engage in a form of conversation or dialogue, often literally a spoken conversation. The means by which a new conversation would be initiated, or a new contract, if you like, would be struck with the spirits, would be by driving a metal object into the wood or other substance from which the figure was made. And this was why a lot of European observers viewed this ritual with horror and trepidation. The age-old belief that witches and sorcerers can do us harm by making a wax or rag effigy of a person and then sticking pins in it. This ritual in West Africa was interpreted by Europeans as being very much the same thing going on. So you're probably thinking by now that this all sounds like the kind of thing that we associate with voodoo. Voodoo is one of a range of religions which has grown up in the Caribbean and in the Americas amongst the descendants of slaves who were taken in many cases precisely from this part of Africa. We talk about voodoo dolls as these little objects that witch doctors stick pins in to bring down curses on people. It's a myth that has its origins in the truth that there were equivalents of these Nkisi figures in the religions that developed in slave society there. So ostensibly, at least, the primary reason why the Europeans were exploring the west coast of Africa from the 16th century onwards was with a view to evangelizing the locals, taking the Christian religious message to this region. Also by the 19th century, the Portuguese are not the only Europeans who are operating in this part of Africa. And this is the time at which this Portuguese word feitiço is heard in use by speakers of other European languages. Thinkers like Auguste Comte, amongst others, were studying the world's different religions and were placing them in different categories on a sort of developmental scale. What he refers to as fetishism was what he considered to be the most primitive stage of human belief. Fetishism being this belief that the divinity or the divine is housed in material objects. It's this conception of the fetish and of fetishism as a primitive form of religion in so-called primitive communities, which is kind of the foundation of the modern use of the term fetish. Now, of course, this may seem incredibly arrogant on the part of 19th century Europe to be saying that there were these vastly more primitive societies in Africa and in Asia and the Pacific. Some figures in the 19th century were recognising that there were similar practices to be found at home. And from this point of departure, we find two sort of streams of thought in modern Europe that use this concept of the fetish to explore really deep-seated anxieties about just how sophisticated or just how civilized European society really is. The first of these is the concept of commodity fetishism that was developed by Karl Marx. The term fetishism was also being taken up by psychologists and by practitioners of the new science of psychoanalysis. So Marx's concept of commodity fetishism is a very complicated one, which I'm not going to attempt to explain in full in 90 seconds. What Marx was arguing was that the value of goods in a capitalist system was not based on the cost of their production, but rather depended effectively on how much people were willing to pay, in a sense, on people's desire for the product. Perhaps a simple example of what Marx is talking about in today's economy is offered by the production of running shoes or trainers. If you think about a very cheap supermarket sneaker such as this one, which sells for maybe sort of £15, can be produced at a cost not greatly different to a designer shoe. This is a very old one, I'm afraid, which might sell for as much as £150, £200, depending on who it's made by and who's endorsing it. Yet both of them are made from the same kind of materials, and both of them fulfill more or less the same utilitarian function of protecting your feet when you're moving very fast. Many psychologists and early sexologists in the late 19th century took an essentially very utilitarian view of human erotic desire. So the term fetish was applied to any kind of case where it appeared that the object of desire was drawing the desiring individual away from what was considered a normal form of sexual desire and sexual activity. That is to say, sexual desire and activity that were focused on attempts to start a family. I think it's safe to say that things have changed immensely in relation to several of these issues over the last 100 years. These days we no longer tend to think of the person who indulges in a fetish as being psychologically ill, as many psychologists in the late 19th century did. People have become so relaxed about this concept of the fetish or the sexual fetish that it's even become, for example, a theme at fancy dress parties. It's something that we think of as maybe a rather saucy joke, but not as a serious pathology, as was the case 100 years ago. So the idea of the fetish as an object or concept invested with power or authority which is not intrinsic to it, and the ubiquity of different types of fetish in our own society is something that draws our attention to the limits of rationality in our own society.